There I stood, blood simmering, watching a woman in her spotless BMW wave a violation notice as if she ruled the world. The day Margaret Thornfield slapped me with a $200 fine for parking at my own cabin was the same day she unknowingly gave me the keys to dismantle her entire HOA empire. The metallic clang of her newly installed gate echoed through the crisp autumn air as she blocked off my bridge, the very bridge my late grandfather had built with his bare hands back in 1943. "Unauthorized vehicle storage," she declared, pointing at my truck parked on land that had been in my family for 3 generations. What Margaret didn't realize was that I owned the only bridge connecting her precious subdivision to the outside world. Every single resident had to cross my property just to reach their $400,000 homes. Are you dealing with a power-hungry HOA president right now? Drop a comment about where you're watching from, because what happened next will make your revenge fantasies seem tame. Let me rewind and explain how this mess began. My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 34 years old, a structural engineer who specializes in building bridges, something that will be very important to this story. 2 years ago, my grandfather passed away and left me his 1940s fishing cabin on Pine Lake. This wasn't just any old cabin. It sat on 3 acres of untouched waterfront, accessible only by a narrow 1-lane bridge that stretched across Whisper Creek. I travel often for work, usually overseas, constructing renewable energy projects, so I rarely had the chance to spend time there. But that cabin meant the world to me. It wasn't just wood, nails, and shingles, it was my grandfather's legacy. Grandpa taught me to fish off that old dock, to recognize every bird call that echoed across the lake, and to listen as he retold story after story about building the bridge with his bare hands. Back in 1943, it was just him, lumber, and determination. But in the last 5 years, the area around the cabin had changed completely. What used to be quiet forest and farmland was transformed into neat rows of lakeside estates, cookie-cutter subdivisions where every house looked like it had been stamped from the same catalog. Nice enough, sure, but nothing like the wilderness sanctuary my grandfather had cherished. And that's when Margaret Thornfield arrived. 52 years old, she'd moved from the city 3 years ago with grand ambitions of becoming the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's standards. She ran for HOA president on promises of boosting property values and enforcing rules, which apparently translated into measuring people's grass with a ruler and timing how long guests parked in their driveways. Margaret drove a spotless white BMW X7, always had manicured nails, and carried around a leather portfolio like she was closing multimillion-dollar deals instead of pestering neighbors about mailbox colors. She had this particular way of glaring at my place. Whenever she thought I wasn't listening, she'd call it that rustic eyesore. The classism in her tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut. So when I returned from a 6-month engineering project in Denmark, you can imagine my shock to find a massive new gate blocking the road to my bridge. And this wasn't just any gate. It was reinforced with concrete posts and slammed shut with a metallic clang that rang through the trees like a warning bell. And there she was, Margaret, waiting for me with her leather portfolio in hand, perfume strong enough to slice through the fresh pine air. She smiled with that fake politeness, then handed me an official-looking document. According to her paperwork, the bridge road was now community property based on some freshly filed surveyor's report. That meant, she claimed, the HOA was responsible for road maintenance, and therefore had the authority to control access. The violation notice she issued me that day was a masterpiece of petty tyranny. $2,000 for unauthorized vehicle storage, just because my truck was parked at the cabin. On top of that, $50 for every day I didn't comply. The math was climbing fast. "I'm sure you understand," Margaret cooed, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We simply can't have unauthorized vehicles cluttering our community roads. It's about property values, really." I dragged my fingers across the rough concrete posts of that new gate, listening to the familiar babble of Whisper Creek running under the bridge. The whole situation felt unreal. This was the same bridge I had crossed 1,000 times as a kid, the same creek where Grandpa taught me to skip stones. Most of the newer residents seemed to back Margaret's iron-fisted approach to running the neighborhood. But the old-timers, the ones who remember this place before it was carved into cookie-cutter lots, carried a quiet sympathy. Betty Chen, a retired teacher who lived closest to the bridge, pressed a folded note into my hand as I walked back to my truck. "Check the county record. Something's fishy." The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled away, already mapping out my next move. Margaret had made one fatal mistake. She thought I was just another pushover resident who would pay up and shut up. What she didn't know was that she had picked a fight with someone who literally builds bridges for a living, and someone who knew exactly what kind of paperwork it takes to own one. Margaret wasted no time escalating things. Within a week of our gate showdown, I got a cease and desist letter from a law firm with a gold-stamped letterhead. The legal jargon was designed to intimidate, accusing me of trespassing and claiming my presence was somehow endangering children in the community, which was laughable considering no kids even lived anywhere near the bridge. The letter demanded I pay their accumulated fines, which by then had already ballooned to $4,500, or face immediate legal action for property damage and public endangerment. Margaret, of course, wasn't content with gates and letters. She made herself busy at the town coffee shop, spreading whispers about how I was unstoppable and making threats. Neither of those things were remotely true, but you know how small-town gossip works. Once it starts, it takes on a life of its own. I could have gotten angry. I could have stormed over to Margaret's perfect little house and had it out with her right there on her manicured lawn. But instead, I did what engineers do best. I gathered data. The county courthouse smelled like old paper and floor wax, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. I spent 3 hours digging through property records, running my fingers across aged parchment documents that had been handled so many times they felt soft as silk. And what I found was absolutely beautiful. Grandpa's original 1943 property deed didn't just cover the cabin and the 3-acre lot. It specifically included ownership of the entire bridge structure, described in precise detail down to the type of timber used and the depth of the foundation pilings. The HOA surveyor had done their homework on everything, except the one thing that mattered most. They conveniently omitted this detail from their report. But here's where it got interesting. The deed included something called an easement clause, a legal requirement that I allow reasonable access to anyone needing to cross the bridge. Seemed fair enough. Grandpa was always a reasonable man. But the devil, as they say, is in the details. The clause specifically defined reasonable as no more than 12 vehicles per day. 12. The current Lakeside Estate subdivision had 4 to 7 homes, most with at least 2 cars. Do the math. Knowledge nugget time. Easement rights can be limited by the original deed specifications, and courts almost always uphold the exact language written by the original property owner. Always check the fine print. It's usually there for a reason. When I realized I basically controlled access to half the subdivision, I'll admit, I smiled. But Margaret wasn't done yet. She escalated by installing a security camera aimed directly at my bridge, claiming it was for community safety monitoring. Then she started keeping a meticulous log of my supposed violations. Every single time I crossed onto my own property, she documented it like she was building a federal case. She even pressured other residents into signing a petition demanding I comply with community standards. Most people signed just to get her to stop knocking on their doors. Margaret's teenage daughter was at one of these petition drives, and I swear that kid rolled her eyes so hard I worried she might need medical attention. But the community was starting to notice. Betty Chen pulled me aside at the post office, whisper creak babbling beneath us to cover our voices, and whisper that Margaret had been asking questions about my finances. Apparently, she wanted to know if I could even afford a legal fight. Over the next few days, 3 longtime residents quietly approached me, one after the other. Tom Hendris, a Vietnam veteran who lived on the lake, told me Margaret had harassed him about his American flag being too large for community standards. Sarah Walsh, who worked for the local newspaper, confided that Margaret had tried to get her fired after she wrote an article about property rights. And the Kowalskis, an elderly couple who had lived here longer than almost anyone, shared how Margaret had forced them to take down their bird feeders because they attracted undesirable wildlife. I was starting to see the truth. This wasn't just about my bridge access. This was a pattern, a campaign of bullying Margaret had been carrying out for months. I was simply the newest target. She had turned what was once a peaceful community into her own personal kingdom, ruling it through fear and intimidation. But here's the thing. I've dealt with petty tyrants before. Construction sites are full of people who think a little authority makes them Napoleon. And Margaret had made a serious mistake. She picked on someone who actually knew how to fight back, and who had the patience to do it right. That evening, I sat on my cabin porch, listening to the haunting calls of loons echoing across the water. I realized this was bigger than just a fight over my right to use the bridge. If I let Margaret steamroll me, she'd keep doing it to others. Someone had to draw the line. And, like it or not, I was the guy with the bridge. Margaret's next move was pure financial warfare. She filed a complaint with the county claiming my bridge was structurally unsafe and demanded an engineering inspection, an inspection that would cost me $32,000. She even rallied the HOA board into voting on an emergency assessment for community safety. Meanwhile, she spread whispers around town that my overseas work was suspicious. In her paranoid little world, building renewable energy projects in Denmark somehow made me an international man of mystery. But here's the thing about challenging a bridge engineer on bridge safety: it's like picking a fight with a chef in their own kitchen. This is my world. I am a bridge engineer. I inspect bridges for a living. And this particular bridge, I could assess it with my eyes closed. That Saturday morning, I gave my grandfather's bridge the full professional treatment. Every joint, every support beam, every stress point, I examined them all, photographing and documenting as I went. The sound of my boots striking those solid planks echoed across the water as I worked, and the sharp, tar-like smell of creosote wood preservative pulled me straight back to childhood memories of helping Grandpa with maintenance when I was 12. From an engineering perspective, what I found was beautiful. Grandpa had overbuilt this bridge as if he expected it to stand until the next ice age. The structure was rated for 20 tons, enough to carry a fully loaded fire truck if it ever came to that. Meanwhile, I couldn't help but notice something ironic. From the bridge approach, Margaret's own deck showed several glaring code violations, plain as day. Knowledge nugget: a bridge rated for 20 tons can handle residential traffic with ease, and whenever someone demands a pricey inspection, it pays to get a second opinion from someone who actually knows the field. Margaret's desperation was beginning to show. She tried to push the town council into condemning my bridge as a public hazard, waving around a petition she claimed had unanimous neighborhood support. The truth unraveled quickly. Half the signatures were forged, and the other half came from people who thought they were signing up for a community barbecue. When that failed, she pivoted to legal theatrics, filing a restraining order against me and claiming I had threatened her. The problem? There were no witnesses, because it never happened. The judge reviewed her so-called evidence, smirked, and all but laughed her out of court. But I wasn't waiting passively for her next attack. I was busy doing my homework. I called 3 of the residents listed on her bridge petition, and not one of them actually knew what they had signed. Margaret had shown up at their doors with a clipboard and some vague story about neighborhood improvements. Here's where it gets interesting. My state is one-party consent, which means I can legally record phone conversations without telling the other person. So, when Margaret's lawyer eventually called to negotiate, I hit record. 20 minutes in, he slipped. He admitted they already knew I owned the bridge but were banking on me not fighting it because most people don't understand property law. His exact words were, "Look, we're banking on this guy not knowing his rights." Wrong bet, counselor. Through all of this, my cat Diesel had become an unofficial judge of character. That orange tabby would perch in the cabin window and hiss every time Margaret's BMW glided past. Even the cat knew something was off about her. And slowly, surely, the rest of the community was beginning to wake up to the truth of what was happening. Betty Chen revealed that she was actually a retired paralegal and quickly offered to help with legal research. Tom Hendris contributed his own expertise from his Army engineering days, sharing knowledge about bridge construction. Sarah Walsh, the local reporter, began digging into HOA finances and asking sharp, uncomfortable questions. We held our strategy sessions at Betty's kitchen table, and let me tell you, that woman brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead. One evening, while we sifted through papers, Sarah mentioned something curious. The HOA's financial records were public, and Margaret had been spending money as if she were running a small nation instead of a neighborhood association. As the loons called across the lake outside, Betty dropped the real bombshell. She had uncovered the HOA's budget reports, and it turned out they were spending almost twice their income. Margaret had greenlit a $40,000 landscaping project that amounted to little more than some decorative boulders and a scattering of shrubs. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about control or petty bullying. The HOA was drowning in financial trouble, and they saw my bridge as a potential revenue stream. Margaret wasn't only power-hungry, she was trying to patch up a financial crisis by reaching into my pocket. The scent of fresh pine drifted through Betty's open kitchen window as we pawed over the documents. That old, familiar sense of satisfaction settled over me, the one I always felt when a complex puzzle began fitting neatly together. Margaret had no idea what kind of storm she had just stirred up. Her next move crossed the line into sabotage. She hired a contractor to install what she described as decorative barriers at the bridge approach, massive concrete blocks positioned to look like landscaping, but clearly designed to prevent my truck from ever reaching the bridge. At 7 a.m, the shriek of a concrete saw tore through the neighborhood, and the dust cloud it produced hung in the air like a miniature tornado. When I arrived to find my access completely blocked, Margaret was there waiting, clipboard in hand, announcing that it was a beautification project approved by the Architectural Committee. The so-called committee, of course, was nothing more than Margaret and 2 residents too afraid to cross her. But in her arrogance, Margaret had finally slipped. This was a mistake I could use in court. I filed an emergency injunction to have those barriers taken down, armed with my original bridge deed and a proper survey that clearly marked the approach road as part of my property. The judge wasn't amused. When Margaret tried to argue about community standards and property values, he cut her off mid-sentence and ordered the barriers removed within 24 hours. When she kept talking, he fined her $25,000 for contempt. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered, and I took the opportunity to share a little knowledge. You cannot legally block someone's access to their own property. That's called landlocking, and it's illegal in all 50 states. Courts treat property access rights very seriously, so always document everything if someone tries to interfere. Margaret's retaliation came fast and, honestly, childishly predictable. She launched a harassment campaign straight out of a middle school playbook. She sent anonymous tips to county inspectors, claiming safety violations at my cabin. She filed noise complaints about my truck, which only came down the road twice a month. She pressured HOA residents to shun me and anyone who dared to support me. She even went so far as to file a complaint against my professional engineering license, claiming I was mentally unstable and a danger to public safety. The licensing board reviewed my spotless record and promptly told her to stop wasting their time. But as her antics escalated, something interesting began to shift in the community. Tom Hendris organized what he proudly called the Bridge Defense Committee, a group of neighbors who were done with Margaret's reign of intimidation. Betty Chen dove deeper into Margaret's history, using her paralegal skills, and what she uncovered was telling. Margaret had pulled similar stunts in her previous neighborhood before moving to Cedar Falls. She had clashed with neighbors, filed frivolous lawsuits, and generally made life miserable for anyone who opposed her. She wasn't improvising. She was repeating a pattern. Meanwhile, Sarah Walsh kept digging into the HOA's finances, and the numbers weren't adding up. She discovered irregular payments, suspicious consulting fees, and expenditures that had no visible benefit to the community. Then came the revelation that tied everything together. During a routine call, my homeowner's insurance agent mentioned something that made my blood run cold. If anything happened to my bridge, if it were damaged or destroyed, the HOA residents themselves would be trapped. Their properties would become landlocked. Values would nosedive, and insurance companies would likely refuse to cover homes inaccessible to emergency vehicles. Margaret thought she was tightening the noose on me. Instead, she was sawing off the very branch she, and everyone else in the neighborhood, was sitting on. When I shared this revelation with the Bridge Defense Committee, you could practically hear the light bulb switching on. Margaret wasn't just harassing me. Her reckless behavior was putting everyone's property values at risk. She must have sensed the tide turning, because she called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she dramatically labeled the Jake problem. Her big reveal: a PowerPoint presentation, complete with Comic Sans font that made even her supporters squirm in their seats. Her proposal was to create a special assessment to buy out my bridge rights for the insulting sum of $5,000. A bridge that would cost at least $200,000 to build today, and she thought she could wave $5,000 under my nose. The audacity was staggering. The community tension hit a breaking point. Anonymous flyers began showing up around the neighborhood, branding me a community enemy. Someone left a nasty note tucked under my truck's windshield wiper. One night, Betty Chen's garden hose was mysteriously slashed. Even the local coffee shop turned into a minefield. Conversations stopped cold the moment I walked in, neighbors picked sides, and people stared each other down like it was a standoff. The peaceful town my grandfather had once loved was quickly unraveling into a war zone, all because one woman couldn't stand the idea of not controlling everyone and everything around her. But I had something Margaret didn't: patience and facts. She was digging herself deeper with every desperate move. The real question wasn't if she'd hang herself with her own rope, it was how much damage she'd caused to the community before it happened. That evening, I sat on my bridge, the steady sound of Whisper Creek flowing beneath me. It struck me then, the water had been moving through this valley long before Margaret showed up, and it would keep flowing long after she was gone. Some forces in life are simply bigger than petty tyrants and their illusions of power. Eddie Chen called me at 6 a.m, her voice trembling with excitement. "Jake, you need to get over here right now. I found something huge in the HOA charter document." I drove over to her place with my coffee still steaming in the cup holder. What she showed me changed everything. Buried deep in the original HOA charter was a clause that stated existing property rights remain unchanged upon formation of the association. And here's the kicker: the HOA wasn't formed until March 2023, 6 months after my grandfather passed away. Legal principle: you can't retroactively change property rights through private agreements formed after the fact. Margaret's entire legal strategy was built on quicksand. But Betty wasn't done. She'd been tearing into the HOA's financial records with the persistence of a bloodhound, and what she uncovered made my coffee go cold. $23,000 was missing from the HOA reserve fund. The payments were traced to something called Thornfield Consulting Services. Margaret had been embezzling from her own neighbors. Sarah Walsh confirmed it an hour later when she showed up carrying bank statements she'd obtained through a public records request. There it was in black and white: Margaret's personal consulting company had been receiving regular payments from the HOA. No contracts, no deliverables, no actual work product. Just community money flowing directly into Margaret's pocket. My hands trembled as I flipped through the documents. And it wasn't from caffeine. This whole bridge fiasco had never been about community standards or property values. Margaret had needed a distraction from her financial crimes, and I had been the perfect scapegoat, an outsider, always traveling, someone easy to paint as a troublemaker while she systematically looted the HOA. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. Margaret wasn't just a petty tyrant anymore, she was a criminal who'd just been caught red-handed. And I was sitting on 3 devastating pieces of evidence: undisputable proof of bridge ownership, documentation of her harassment campaign, and now, evidence of outright embezzlement. Knowledge nugget: when someone escalates a conflict unreasonably, start asking yourself what they are trying to hide. Bullies often lash out to deflect attention from their own wrongdoing. Margaret's vulnerability was exposed like a raw nerve. Her lawyer quietly withdrew from the case, citing ethical concerns. In lawyer speak, that meant they knew their client was guilty of sin. Even 2 board members who had stood shoulder to shoulder with her began edging away, scrambling to save their own reputations. Even Margaret's husband had begun asking uncomfortable questions about their sudden financial improvements. The whispers in the community, which once praised her leadership, now shifted toward suspicion. Neighbors started remembering details, like how she pushed through that costly landscaping project without proper bids, or how she insisted on handling all the finances herself instead of using the HOA's accounting firm. I knew I could have pursued legal action on my own and probably walked away with a decent settlement. But this had become bigger than just my bridge access. It was about protecting the entire community from a predator who had been systematically stealing from her neighbors while bullying anyone who dared question her authority. The sound of Whisper Creek beneath my bridge had become my thinking music. The water flowed steady and patient, inevitable, wearing down obstacles not with force, but persistence. Margaret had underestimated the quiet strength of patience combined with facts. She was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between true authority and the kind built on fear and deception. With the evidence of her embezzlement now out in the open, our small resistance group transformed into something far more organized. Betty Chen's kitchen became our war room. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the tense energy of people who were done being pushed around. We mapped out our strategy like a military campaign. Betty handled the legal research and documentation. Her paralegal training was worth its weight in gold. Tom Hendris used his natural leadership to coordinate with other affected residents, building a strong coalition. Sarah Walsh worked tirelessly on her investigative article, making sure every detail was bulletproof before it went public. I called in a favor from a lawyer friend, who agreed to guide our legal strategy pro bono. Turns out, when you've got rock-solid evidence of embezzlement, attorneys suddenly get very interested in helping out. Our strategy had 3 prongs: file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General for HOA fraud, demand a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances, and seek damages for harassment, defamation, and interference with property rights. On top of that, we were pushing for Margaret's immediate removal from the HOA board. But I wasn't leaving it all to the lawyers. I compiled a comprehensive bridge inspection report detailed enough to make the Army Corps of Engineers proud. Every stress calculation, every load-bearing analysis, every safety protocol, I documented it all with professional photographs and detailed explanations. To make it airtight, I even brought in a colleague from my engineering firm for independent verification. Knowledge nugget: HOA board members have fiduciary duties, which means they are legally required to act in the community's best interest, not their own. Embezzlement of HOA funds is a felony in most states, and residents always have the right to inspect financial records. Demand transparency. The technical preparation was critical, but the real battle was building community support. I went door to door, personally visiting every affected resident. I explained the facts without attacking Margaret's character, letting the evidence speak for itself. The response was overwhelming. People weren't just angry about being manipulated, they were furious about being robbed. Before long, we had a coalition of 31 out of 47 homeowners. These weren't just names on a petition, these were people ready to stand up and be counted when the fight got tough. Tom's wife started bringing homemade cookies to our planning sessions, and she jokingly dubbed us the Bridge Club, a name that stuck. Diesel, my orange tabby, became our unofficial mascot, sitting in on every meeting and purring loudly whenever we made progress, as if giving us his stamp of approval. Betty's color-coded filing system was so meticulous it could have impressed the FBI. Every document was cross-referenced, every timeline verified, every piece of evidence organized for maximum impact. Honestly, the woman had missed her true calling as a federal investigator. But Margaret wasn't sitting idle. Margaret tried to spy on our activities, even hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on me. She spread rumors that our planning group was nothing more than conspiracy theorists out to destroy the community. She even attempted to schedule a competing HOA meeting on the exact same night as the town hall we'd requested. Meanwhile, I reached out to my professional network. Engineering colleagues provided character references. Former clients sent testimonials about my integrity. My professional association confirmed my reputation was spotless. Even contacts from my international renewable energy projects vouched for the legitimacy of my work overseas. The trap we were setting was elegant in its simplicity. We were going to let Margaret expose herself at a public meeting with county officials and the media present. I prepared questions designed to force her into lying on record, and Sarah Walsh had already tipped off state fraud investigators about the embezzlement. The sound of papers rustling filled Betty's kitchen as we organized our evidence for maximum impact. We assigned speaking roles to each team member, prepared backup plans for Margaret's predictable responses, and arranged media coverage to guarantee accountability. During evening inspections, the smooth texture of the bridge cables under my hands reminded me why I became an engineer in the first place: to build things that last, to solve problems that matter, to make communities stronger and safer. Margaret had spent months trying to tear down what my grandfather had built. Now it was time to show her what happens when you pick a fight with someone who builds bridges instead of burning them. As autumn leaves crunched under our feet during final preparations, I realized this battle had grown into something far larger than property rights. It was about standing up to bullies, about protecting communities from predators, about proving that ordinary people can fight corruption when they work together. The loons called across Pine Lake as we finalized our plans, their cries echoing the same truth that had been flowing beneath my bridge all along. Some things are worth fighting for, and patience combined with truth is an unstoppable force. Margaret was about to discover that the hard way. Her desperation hit a new level when she tried to physically damage my bridge at 3 in the morning with a crowbar. The metallic scraping and her heavy breathing were caught in crystal-clear audio by the security camera I'd installed after her earlier sabotage attempts. Watching the footage the next morning was surreal. There she was, the HOA president, the same woman who preached endlessly about community standards, caught on video attacking private property like a deranged vandal. The damage itself was minimal. Grandpa's bridge was built far too well for a crowbar to do much harm. But the intent was undeniable. I filed a police report but chose not to press charges immediately. Instead, I used the footage strategically, quietly sharing it with the remaining HOA board members who still had any sense of decency. The effect was immediate. 2 more members resigned rather than be associated with Margaret's increasingly unhinged behavior. But Margaret wasn't finished embarrassing herself. She launched a full-scale smear campaign, using anonymous social media accounts to attack my reputation. Fake reviews of my engineering work began appearing online. Posts claiming I was dangerous and mentally unstable flooded local Facebook groups. Ironically, the cyberbullying only worked against her. Knowledge nugget: anonymous online attacks can be traced and prosecuted. Defamation is still defamation, whether it's spoken aloud or posted online. Screenshot everything. Digital evidence disappears quickly, but screenshots are permanent. The community was growing disgusted with Margaret's antics. Her own neighbors began reporting suspicious late-night activity around her house. The support that once propped up her reign of intimidation was evaporating faster than morning dew. Meanwhile, Betty Chen's banking contacts uncovered something even more damning. Margaret had tried to secure an emergency loan against HOA reserves without proper board approval. When the bank refused, she forged board member signatures on the loan documents. That's when I knew we had her completely. Embezzlement was bad enough, but forgery crossed into federal crime territory. Margaret must have sensed the walls closing in, because she made one last desperate move. Out of the blue, she called me, her voice trembling, and offered a bribe, $15,000 to drop everything and walk away. I recorded that conversation legally, and it turned out to be a gold mine. In her desperation, Margaret admitted she may have mishandled HOA funds and even accidentally confessed to financial irregularities I hadn't uncovered yet. She was unraveling in real time. "Look, Jake," she pleaded, her voice cracking, "maybe I got a little overzealous about community standards. Maybe some paperwork got mixed up. But we can work this out privately, can't we?" Meanwhile, tension in the community was reaching a breaking point. Some residents feared the scandal would tank property values. Others were furious that the HOA fees had been used to fund Margaret's crimes. The once peaceful neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse. At community gatherings, the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. People were choosing sides in grocery store aisles. Former friends stopped speaking. Margaret had managed to fracture a community that had lived in harmony for years. But not everyone was fooled by her act. 3 more residents came forward with their own stories, tales of harassment, financial misconduct, and abuse of power dating back to her very first year as HOA president. The pattern was undeniable to anyone willing to see the truth. Then came Margaret's final threat, and it revealed just how far gone she was. One evening, she called me again, her voice completely unhinged, and threatened to destroy my reputation if I didn't back down. She claimed to have powerful connections who could ruin my career, and even implied she would fabricate safety violations on my bridge if I kept pushing forward. By then, it was clear. Margaret was completely detached from reality. She was already facing criminal charges, had lost the support of her community, and her husband had moved out with the kids. Yet, she still believed she could intimidate her way out of the mess she had created. I documented every escalation carefully, building a timeline that highlighted her increasingly erratic behavior. My restraint and professionalism throughout the ordeal stood in sharp contrast to her desperate thrashing. That evening, as I sat on my bridge listening to the steady flow of water below and watching the stars reflect across Pine Lake's surface, I realized Margaret had become her own worst enemy. Every move she made to escape accountability only pulled her deeper into the hole she had dug for herself. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had started this whole battle trying to steal money and maintain power through fear. Now she was staring down criminal prosecution, her reputation destroyed so completely that she would never hold authority over anyone again. Sometimes the best revenge is simply giving your enemies enough rope to hang themselves. Margaret's final desperate act was her most dramatic yet. At 2 a.m, she called County Emergency Services, claiming that my bridge was actively collapsing and posed an immediate danger to public safety. Sirens shattered the quiet night as fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency vehicles raced toward the bridge, diesel engines growling and radio chatter breaking the stillness. The chaos woke half the neighborhood. At 2:47 a.m., I got the call from the fire chief. "Jake, we've got reports of structural failure at your bridge. We need you down here to assess the situation." When I arrived, Margaret stood there in her bathrobe, pointing dramatically at the bridge and insisting she had heard cracking sounds that signaled imminent collapse. The fire chief, a no-nonsense man named Captain Rodriguez, gave her one skeptical glance before turning to me. "You're the engineer who built bridges overseas, right?" he asked. When I nodded, he added, "Mind taking a look and telling us what you think?" My inspection took less than 10 minutes. Every joint was tight, every support beam was steady, and the structure stood as solid as the day my grandfather had finished it. Captain Rodriguez watched closely as I worked, and when I finally gave him my assessment, he turned to the crowd of neighbors and first responders and declared, loud enough for everyone to hear, that the bridge was safer than most county roads. Margaret's credibility died right there in front of a dozen witnesses. The fire chief didn't bother with diplomacy. Filing false emergency reports is a crime. You've wasted taxpayer resources and put real emergencies at risk by tying up our crews. His words hit harder than anything I could have said. But the real bombshell came the very next morning, when state investigators concluded their forensic audit of the HOA finances. The number was staggering, $31,000 in unexplained expenses. Every cent was traced back to Margaret's personal accounts through fake invoices for consulting services that never even existed. Knowledge nugget: every digital transaction leaves a permanent trail, and forensic accountants are like bloodhounds when it comes to tracking money. Embezzlement often starts small, but it escalates quickly when nobody is paying attention. Margaret's psychological breakdown after the audit was painful to watch. She began accusing random neighbors of being part of conspiracies against her. She taped paranoid notes to people's doors, claiming I was part of some deep state plot to destroy suburban communities. By then, her husband had already moved out with the kids, and even her most loyal supporters were quietly backing away. But while she unraveled, something beautiful started happening within the neighborhood. Residents organized a Bridge Appreciation Day. Families brought picnics to the water's edge, celebrating the structure that symbolized connection instead of division. Children filled the bridge approaches with chalk art, transforming what Margaret had tried to weaponize into a landmark of unity. The media attention was overwhelming. Sarah Walsh's article was picked up by regional news stations, and soon the story went viral on social media under the hashtag #BridgeJustice. National HOA reform advocates began citing our case as the perfect example of what happens when petty tyrants are given unchecked power. Margaret quickly became a cautionary tale in property rights circles, the poster child for everything wrong with HOA culture. Her face spread across news sites as the HOA president who tried to steal a bridge. Meanwhile, the legal consequences closed in fast. The state attorney general filed criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. On top of that, the HOA itself filed a civil lawsuit demanding full restitution. Her real estate license was under review for professional misconduct, and the IRS had begun asking uncomfortable questions about unreported income. As I sat on my bridge at sunset, reflecting on everything that had unfolded, I realized this fight had never really been about me. I had become a symbol of something larger, the idea that ordinary people could stand up to petty tyranny and win. The evening birds called across the lake, and the quiet felt like a benediction after months of chaos. Margaret had tried to turn my inheritance into her personal cash cow, but instead she awakened a community that refused to be bullied. Her final desperate move was an attempted escape, trying to flee town with the last $8,000 in HOA funds she could still access. Airport security stopped her at the gate, and local news cameras captured her perp walk in all its pathetic glory. In handcuffs, her carefully polished image finally cracked. Beneath the expensive clothes and manufactured authority, Margaret looked like what she had always been, a small-time crook who let greed consume her. The woman who had spent months trying to destroy my reputation had now become a national laughingstock. Her own actions had accomplished what no rival ever could. She had built her own prison out of lies, theft, and abuse of power. As the police car carried her away, I couldn't help but think of Grandpa's bridge, still standing strong, still connecting people, still serving its purpose long after the person who tried to steal it was forgotten. Some things are built to last. Others are destined to collapse. The town hall that night was packed beyond capacity, 200 people crammed into a space meant for half that number. 3 news stations had set up cameras, and reporters filled the back rows, scribbling notes. The mayor had called an emergency meeting after Margaret's arrest made regional headlines, and the entire community wanted to witness the conclusion of this saga. I stepped to the podium with my presentation materials, calm in a way I hadn't expected, ready to expose months of corruption in front of half the county. My visuals were simple but devastating. A timeline of harassment, copies of the original bridge deed, and financial records that clearly showed where the HOA's money had gone. Ladies and gentlemen, I began. 6 months ago, I thought I was just dealing with an overzealous HOA president. What I discovered instead was systematic theft of your community funds, harassment of residents, and abuse of power that turned our neighborhood into a dictatorship. The room fell completely silent as I walked through the evidence. Every harassment incident was documented with photos and timestamps. Every financial irregularity was tracked through bank records. Every lie Margaret had told was countered with undeniable documents. Margaret sat in the front row, flanked by her court-appointed attorney and a county sheriff's deputy. Though technically out on bail, her lawyer had instructed her to remain silent. That advice lasted about 5 minutes. When I played the recording of Margaret's bribery attempt, her own voice admitting to mistakes with HOA funds, she shot to her feet and started shouting accusations. This is all a conspiracy. Jake orchestrated my financial problems. He's been planning this from the beginning. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, trying to get her back into her chair, but Margaret was beyond reason. She spun around, pointing wildly at people in the room, insisting everyone was against her, claiming I had somehow forced her to embezzle money and harass neighbors. In front of 200 witnesses and 3 news cameras, Margaret was unraveling completely. Mrs. Thornfield, the mayor cut in firmly. "You out of order. Please sit down." "Out of order?" Margaret screamed back. "I'll show you what's out of order. This man has destroyed everything I worked to build in this community." That was when I delivered the line I had been saving for months. "Margaret, the only thing you built in this community was a criminal enterprise funded by your neighbor's HOA fees. The only thing I destroyed was your ability to keep stealing from the people who trusted you." The crowd erupted in applause. Even some of Margaret's former allies were clapping. Camera flashes lit up the room as photographers captured the moment, a petty tyrant finally being called out in public. Betty Chen took the microphone next, explaining how her legal research had exposed Margaret's fraudulent property claims. Tom Hendris followed, describing the harassment campaign against veterans in the neighborhood. Then 3 other residents stood up to share their own stories of intimidation and bullying. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a single dispute over bridge access. This was a long-standing system of abuse that had poisoned the community for years. County Sheriff Martinez stepped forward to outline the criminal charges: first-degree embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and filing false police reports. A state investigator added that their case was still ongoing, and federal authorities were reviewing potential tax violations. An FBI representative confirmed that they were investigating possible mail fraud tied to the fake HOA documents. Judge Patterson, who had attended simply as a community member, stood up and announced an emergency restraining order. Margaret was now prohibited from setting foot on HOA property or attending meetings. She was also ordered to surrender all HOA documents and any remaining funds in her possession. The media swarmed immediately. Reporters pressed me about property rights advocacy. National HOA reform organizations reached out, asking if I would testify before state legislatures. Online, the story was trending fast, with thousands of comments pouring in from people across the country sharing their own HOA horror stories. Margaret's final humiliation came when Sheriff Martinez placed her in handcuffs and led her out while the cameras rolled. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood was now reduced to a cautionary tale broadcast across the region. Children who once shrank from her nasty glares now waved goodbye as the police car pulled away. The community's response was almost cathartic. People who hadn't spoken in months hugged each other, apologizing for letting things drag on for so long. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up finally began sharing their stories. The smell of coffee and the buzz of nervous energy filled the crowded room as residents started planning how to rebuild. Camera flashes continued to pop, capturing not only Margaret's downfall, but also the moment a neighborhood decided to heal and move forward together. When the meeting ended and we stepped out into the cool evening air, I felt a deep sense of closure. Grandpa's bridge had become more than just access to a cabin. It was now a symbol of standing up to bullies and protecting communities from predators. Justice had been served, but something more important had happened. The community had realized its own strength to fight back. The transformation was remarkable. Within 30 days, residents had elected a brand new HOA board, with Betty Chen chosen unanimously as president by neighbors who had learned the hard way what happens when you give unchecked power to the wrong person. They asked me to join the board, but I politely declined. I'd had more than enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. Margaret's legal troubles snowballed exactly as expected. She pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud, receiving 2 years in prison and 5 years of probation. The judge ordered her to pay $47,000 in restitution to the HOA, money that went toward repairing the financial damage she had caused. Her real estate license was permanently revoked, and her husband filed for divorce before she was even out on bail. But the real healing happened inside the community itself. That October, exactly 1 year after Margaret tried to block my access, I organized the first annual Bridge Festival. Families brought picnics, kids covered the bridge approaches in chalk art and games, and together we raised $8,000 for local veterans programs recommended by Tom Harris. The most meaningful moment of all came when Margaret's teenage daughter arrived carrying a handwritten apology letter. She had watched her mother's behavior with horror and wanted to make things right. She became the very first recipient of the engineering scholarship fund I established, funded by donations from grateful neighbors who wanted to turn a painful chapter into something hopeful. My personal life took an unexpected turn, too. Instead of returning to overseas work, I chose to open an engineering consulting firm right here in Cedar Falls. To my surprise, there was a huge demand for someone who specialized in helping small communities with infrastructure issues. I'd found my calling in service rather than just profit. The property rights education website I created went on to help dozens of other neighborhoods battling the same kind of HOA tyranny we had endured. I was invited to testify before 3 state legislatures on HOA reform, and the Cedar Falls case is now cited in legal textbooks as proof of how ordinary people can fight back against corruption. The conservation project around Grandpa's Bridge became something he would have loved. Partnering with environmental groups, we turned the area into a protected wildlife habitat, complete with educational programs about the local ecosystem. The bridge Margaret once tried to steal became a living symbol of community stewardship and environmental protection. Ironically, property values in lakeside estates actually rose after the scandal. Real estate professionals weren't surprised. They knew buyers preferred communities that had already proven they could handle corruption, rather than those where it might still be hiding in the shadows. The ripple effects of our stand were enormous. Sarah Walsh won a regional journalism award for her reporting on HOA financial abuse. Betty Chen's systematic documentation methods are now taught in paralegal schools across the state. Tom Hendris launched a consulting service to help other communities organize against HOA overreach. The Bridge Defense Committee evolved into a permanent community advocacy group that meets monthly at Betty's house, Diesel included, still serving proudly as the official mascot. Even Margaret's old house found redemption. After the bank foreclosed, it was turned into a thriving community garden. There's something poetic about rows of tomatoes and sunflowers growing where so much toxicity once festered. Children who had once trembled under her angry stares now laugh and play among the garden beds. 6 months ago, a family moved to Cedar Falls specifically because they'd heard about our fight against corruption. They told us they wanted to live in a place that had already proven it wouldn't tolerate bullies. That's when I knew, beyond a doubt, that we had truly won. The final statistics tell the rest of the story. HOA financial health fully restored within 6 months. 0 harassment complaints since Margaret's removal. 12 other communities have reached out for guidance on their own struggles. And most meaningful of all, the county declared Grandpa's bridge historically significant, ensuring it will be protected for generations to come. Looking back, I realized it was never really about bridge access or HOA fees. It was about whether ordinary people would stand up to petty tyrants who think authority gives them the right to steal and intimidate. Sometimes, it only takes one person willing to push back to give everyone else permission to stop being afraid. As I write this, I can hear children's laughter echoing across the bridge during this year's festival. The smell of barbecue smoke drifts through the crisp autumn air, and Old Glory waves proudly from the bridge tower. Grandpa's structure still stands solid and enduring, just like the justice it came to represent. Now, I want to hear from you. Share your own HOA nightmare stories in the comments below. You'd be amazed how many of them follow the same pattern. And if this story inspired you to stand up to bullies in your own community, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't believe what happened in the next town.